Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm back with Erik and I'm super excited. His webinar today is based on his talk that he did at Explore DDD, and it's e-commerce with DDD and event sourcing. Take it away, Erik.
Thanks, Natasha. Hi, everyone. Again, my name's Erik, and let's start with some sort of a bold statement. Get this thing started and go strong. So, I'm of the belief that a lot of software projects could benefit from more domain-driven design and event sourcing. Now, they're separate things. They work in their own worlds. They're orthogonal. But together, they really create a powerful force that brings a lot of value. So I'm in the camp that if just more developers, engineers, directors, technical leads, any power deciders, as it were able to leverage these two things, we would have a lot more robust, maintainable, extendable, the list goes on, of value-bearing tools at our disposal rather than being reactive to the needs of the business. We can be proactive by implementing these techniques effectively. So I'm here to talk about event sourcing, no surprise, and how it can be influenced by domain-driven design concepts such as tactical and strategic modeling techniques. And really a lot of ideas and concepts that have been laid out by the DDD community over the last really 2 decades, which is wild, and the forerunners. So again, event sourcing is a data storage technique, right? And what I'm getting at, and I'll move the slides here in a second, is that if we were able to care about our data more clearly up front by using these techniques and patterns, strategies, we probably don't need to be as dependent on some of these other techniques and technologies such as CDC, ETL, things like that. Not to say they don't have a purpose and that they don't bring value. They certainly do. But it feels like a lot of organizations are trying to make sense of their data after the fact. That statement alone just kind of brings a lot of questions like what why aren't you able to tell these things up front, right? So let me try to be a bit more concise and convey this a bit more differently and make sure I actually click the right buttons on my slides. I am proposing that if data is an asset to your organization, why aren't you treating it like such? That's my question to you. Whether you're a developer that's just new in the game of software in general, you're new to event sourcing, you've never heard DDD, or you have decades of experience, and maybe you've written blogs and books about this. You never know who's out there in the audience, especially when I presented at Explore DDD last month. There were people in the audience that I've been looking up to for a long time. That was a bit surreal. So anyways, hello again. My name's Erik. I'm a developer advocate here at Event Store. There are my contact details if you would like to get hold of me. I am kind of looking at chat, and Natasha also can help with that. But typically in this style of presentation, I probably won't get to questions until the end. But if something comes to mind later on, or you would like to ask just more detailed things and have a real conversation, yeah, contact me, please. That's really one of my roles here. Someone also gave me really good feedback on the prior presentation or webinar I did, and they couldn't tell what my cat's name is. That's really important to me. So his name's King Koopa. There you go. If you have any questions, that's how it's spelled. So I just want to make sure I address that feedback. I do like getting critiques. So also, before we get further along, there are more webinars queued up. The next one is going to be about design principles. So it's kind of in the same vein. It's going to be a bit more specific, is my understanding. It's part 2 of this series. That's going to be in a few weeks in May. And also, you should join our Discord community. Honestly, if I looked at the join logs this last week after Tony Young's wonderful webinar, a bunch of people joined. It was kind of overwhelming. So yeah, get in there. So again, just want to convey that this talk was initially done at Explore DDD. I've tweaked and updated a few things to make it better fit for this audience is how I'll word it, right? Not presenting to people I think that are writing books about this, but maybe. So one thing I like to do with some of these presentations is, rather than telling my credentials or whatever, because you probably don't care, and that's okay, that's fine. I'm going to go over some of the titles for the presentation that could have been, and that'll give you an insight as to perhaps where I'm going with this, my point of view, things like that. So yeah, how do you influence people into using event sourcing, right? That's I guess a secret agenda, right? No news there. Effective communication, I don't know if it would solve world, hunger or wars, but I think just communicating better in general would probably help all of us, right? Yeah, DDD is something I learned while learning event sourcing, and CQRS as well. It seems like a common path is you're already in that camp or community. You're learning about these tactical patterns and strategic patterns and things like that. And then you learn about CQRS or event sourcing. It seems like a lot of folks aren't in that path nowadays, though, like myself, where you learn about event sourcing because of a specific use case in your organization, and then you learn about these other methodologies and philosophies. And yeah, I know some of you might be a little concerned about DDD. I appreciate you joining and listening in. If you are a little apprehensive, because it sounds like it could be a way to get back into waterfall, which sounds very scary. Like, are we designing things years in advance? No, definitely not. But there are people that I've heard that feedback from, which I find kind of fascinating. Just because you give a crap is the wording I've heard before about design and implementation and how things work and the organization at large, doesn't mean everything is pre-planned. So we're going to go into that and demystify that a little bit. And then yeah, I won't be live coding this webinar. I'm sorry. Maybe next time. Next webinar, I think is going to be exciting. More details about that later. But here's our loose agenda. I kind of shuffled things a little bit, but we're going to go over this back story, this problem space, to better key you into what DDD is and how it lends itself well to event sourcing. So even if you are somewhat familiar with these concepts, I hope this is a bit of a refreshing take for you. So we're going to go into that, kind of go over some diagrams, a little bit of code, some downstream uses, and next steps really is just go to the next webinar. But spoiler alert. All right, so the problem space. What's the backstory? Disclaimer, these are just things that I imagined, but some may have been influenced and inspired by my time in the e-commerce industry, also as a consultant working with other organizations and teams and individuals as to what they could do with their existing solutions or migration plans, things like that. So any likeness is just happenstance. That's not the word I was looking for, but I'm going to go with it. Okay, so let me just make sure everything is ready. Take a sip of my liquid refreshment here. Okay, so there's a startup, like any good story, and it's your friend. They started fixing electronics in their garage, perhaps during the pandemic or something that they just found interesting. They had some loose gadgets, technology pieces, and they had a real knack for it. Maybe this is something that they've been doing for years, perhaps. Especially with repairing graphics cards is probably profitable at this point with AI and AI using graphics processing units. But let's imagine, again, that's your friend, right? And they happen to be selling these goods, these repaired goods, on a popular auction website. You might be able to tell what it is by the colors, but also they're buying things that are maybe partially working or broken, and then again repairing or doing whatever, and then selling it, effectively reselling. And yeah, they're getting really invested. Very exciting. You should support your friends, and eventually they make it their full-time gig. That's our backstory. And then your friend has a question. They're asking for your assistance. This might be a little scary. So especially as mobile apps rose in popularity. I think a few of us probably heard the, hey, I got an idea for an app. Could you make it? So we're kind of going down that road. But no, your friend asks, what is an API? And point being is that they are selling on this popular auction website so much that they're looking into documentation on how to do it more effectively. Maybe they could build some sort of app or system or loop, if they're familiar with programming concepts, to do things automatically, right? That's what software and programming is effectively, right? So that kind of comes out of left field, but you suggest, let's say you're too busy. You're trying to balance work life and all that fun stuff, and you suggest another mutual friend could help out. Okay, cool. So this other mutual friend builds this basic app for this individual. It integrates, it interfaces with this auction website, and it does things like managing the inventory. It helps post listings, maybe organize like a customer base and addresses and emails, all that fun stuff. Maybe it automatically sends an email and says, congratulations. Right. We're just kind of letting our imaginations go wild. And the app's written in, drum roll, yes, your favorite language, Visual Basic. I don't want to give crap to any specific language, but I've been there. I've used Visual Basic. It paid my bills. That's what I'll say about it. Now, this other mutual friend that's helping your friend's business, they're really resourceful, but they don't consider themselves a software developer. They're basically kind of looking up and learning things as they go, which I'm sure a lot of us can relate to, especially just when a new piece of technology or library comes out. But they don't have like a background with software development. So let's fast forward. I know we're kind of going over these details a bit too much, perhaps, but they start taking a move fast and break things mentality, which is a quote you may be familiar with. So just on the business side, I just want to kind of reiterate and give good context and help your immersion that, this organization that's blooming, this startup, now has to think about renting a warehouse, hiring folks, making sure they're a culture fit, so to speak, signing contracts of all kinds to buy goods, sell them, leasing, delegating, managing. Maybe they're not used to management. Like, it's just so much chaos, right? So I just want to paint that picture. If you're unfamiliar with that environment, there's a lot of things going on, and we're not even talking about the software. So basically stuff that they might not even typically be involved in, they have to prioritize the company's needs, right? Each day is different adventures. If you've ever been in a startup culture or company rather, you probably know what I'm talking about. So got to have some memes. I need that cheeseburger on my desk yesterday, right? Things are just moving. So let's fast forward a bit more. They iterate and they build a second system, perhaps, right? They now have hired dedicated software developers. Very cool. It's a bit monolithic, and the prior monolithic code base was getting a bit unmaintainable, and that there's, again, all sorts of factors we could chalk that up to, of being unfamiliar with good design techniques and blah, blah, blah. But let's just imagine. So there's a new code repository. There's going to be a new system written. And what language is it going to use? Guess. All right. It's going to be C#, which I'm fond of, but it's another .NET language. That's not really going to come up in this talk. It came up more so in Explore DDD. But point being is that sometimes you want to have a lot of things connected during migrations, right? So they show something that's somewhat familiar, they can migrate from, has the same runtime, things like that. And they're excited about being able to really kind of determine their architecture and design up front. And some of them have experience with messaging and events. Ooh, right? So they basically have a list of attributes they want to have. It's probably going to be monolithic. They're not too comfortable with a bunch of microservices right out of the gate. Understandable. They want to enable autonomy as they keep hiring and developing new teams. Awesome. Having a looser asynchronous dependencies, right? Ideally, no shared business logic, but some of us know how that goes. and sovereignty of data. Yeah, we'll go into that in a second here. Let me just click this. All right, so is it going to go as planned? Uh-oh. All right. So, again, just glancing over these details, but they basically do a monolithic-ish design. It's called a self-contained system. I'm not going to go over the details really here. I the other month I called it effectively a modular monolith, and there were people who agreed with me, and there were some people who were not happy with my assessment that they're kind of very similar. So if you have a hot take or an opinion on that, leave a comment. All right, so let's rehydrate before we get deeper into this. Let's fast forward a little bit as well. All right, so present day. So let's say we joined this organization. I didn't explicitly put that here, but basically we've joined the organization. Your friend's like, hey, I can give you a pretty sweet gig, help you lead this team and this new opportunity that's come up. So there are now, compared to previously, smaller value-oriented teams. They have some autonomy. I'm not going to get into Conway's Law here, but you should certainly look it up if you're unfamiliar with it. There are a lot of migrations going on from that monolithic SCS, which is exciting, building more value, specific targeted services, things like that. I don't want to say microservices. They might not be micro. There's still some dealings with a shared legacy database. That is a pain point we'll revisit a little bit. But there's all sorts of opportunities, right? Migrations, sorts of greenfield development, which is very exciting. Also brownfield as well. But there's just so much that needs to be done. Really, it's as someone who joins this team as one of the, let's say, tech leads, you have a lot of autonomy and decision-making power as to what needs to be prioritized and how you can best bring value. So it's a great opportunity for you in your personal career, right? Very exciting. So let's go over what team you're part of. And this may be from inspired by things I've done, perhaps, maybe. But yeah, your team is in charge of getting updates from your upstream partners, and it has to do with inventory, pricing, content, things like that. Again, it's the e-commerce world. So all these updates that need to happen, along with applying rules. Now, when I say applying rules, I'll give an example. So let's say there's a title for a listing on the popular auction website I mentioned earlier. Well, now that the company has moved to other marketplaces as well, they're selling on all sorts of things, like a dozen of them. Maybe certain marketplaces don't want certain words or characters or what have you in the titles or the names, or maybe their listings allow HTML, maybe they don't, right? So there are certain rules, and rules could be preferences, but it could be something that they demand as part of a service agreement of sorts, right? These rules can vary widely, and not going into details here, but maybe that's a good thing for a future webinar. But your team needs to aggregate all this data. Again, all sorts of stuff. Really, it's effectively all data regarding products of any kind, be it more meta, inventory, content, pricing, whatever. It's effectively all of it. All that needs to be aggregated. Again, the rules applied, and needs to be pushed downstream, because the downstream team is the one who updates the marketplace, the auction websites and stuff like that. So let's just call this primary system that your team has the builder. Now, really, there's a lot of different builders that are deployed, and there may be many instances of it, but it is known as the builder, right? It builds the listings effectively, right? Cool. Again, there's upstream data coming in from inventory partners, pricing partners, content partners, all sorts of other things. We aren't even going to get into restrictions where maybe a brand says, hey, don't sell anything for this week because we need to renegotiate or something like that. Those are all fun sorts of edge cases. But again, these updates get aggregated, yada, 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 and they go downstream to the various marketplaces like the auction website. And let's zoom out a little bit. And again, it's probably should have blew this up a little bit, but there's more complexity than I'm letting on, right? There's multiple adjacent services or sidecars. There are perhaps conflicts with the upstream data that's coming in. You might have multiple deployments and instances. Now there's concurrency issues, and there's race conditions and all sorts of fun locks happening because, again, perhaps your team's dependent on that legacy database, right? So you probably see where I'm going with this, right? So again, there's lots of complexity. There's other apps that are responsible for things. Things are being updated in the database that you didn't know others had access to. That's a whole nother conversation regarding access and permissions and stuff. Whew. So things are getting, hopefully we're painting a good picture of the complexity here. So again, complexity increases. But okay, all right. Erik, what are you talking about? What we haven't even discussed domain-driven design. What is going on? Okay, well, let's pump the brakes. And I want to show one diagram. We're not going to dive into it immediately, but it's like a teaser that there is a method, so to speak, to this madness that I'm laying out, that certain things can be iterated upon. There's certain techniques and strategies, right? The discovery aspect, there's strategizing, there's composition and organizing, and then there's I think the most fun part, which is coding, right? Implementation. So this is just, there are links at the bottom here. We'll have the slides also posted shortly after this. But there are all sorts of techniques that can be implemented that have been paved by the forerunners, as I'll call it, of the DDD community. So is this DDD in a nutshell? No. And I do like this meme a lot. You may have seen it before. But okay, so DDD, also the book itself is referred to as the Blue Book. It was written by Erik Evans. He has a great first name. Written 20 years ago now. But the subtitle is called Tackling Complexity in the Heart of Software. And I really like that because even though it's a big read, and you don't necessarily need to read it all, I'm not suggesting you have to, but it really gives you a nice wide tool set and different methodologies for being able to tackle complexity. And probably the easiest way to describe it, again, without going over the 600 pages itself, is that there is strategic design and tactical design. Now, let me make sure my other slides are up to snuff here. 1 second. We'll pretend that didn't happen. Okay, so what are the goals of strategic design? Really it's so things can be employed to gain a deeper understanding of your domain. So in our case of e-commerce, needing to understand how inventory works. It's not just, 50 minus 1, minus 1, minus 1 as soon as you get a sale. There might be things that get broken inside the warehouses, things that might be returned. Perhaps if you have your own website, you might do a hold if an item is in a cart or during that checkout process. Maybe not. It depends, right? A favorite phrase of ours. But strategic design effectively gives you a nice solid foundation for your domain model. And when I'm saying domain model here, I'm using it in the like a plural sense, that your domain model really can encompass a whole lot. There is the domain model, which could be like a class in your code, but really I'm talking about it at large here. So these techniques include, but are not limited to, domain storytelling, getting knowledge from your domain experts. Maybe you're conducting interviews with the stakeholders, things like that. You're doing like storytelling exercises, which honestly are a blast because you understand what the heck is happening and understanding it better from the user's perspective. You might employ something like event storming, which is a collaborative model to model out the domain at large. And honestly, when it comes to event sourcing, I think I've used this in other presentations, but event storming allows you to map events you very quickly by having a bunch of sticky notes and other team members and subject matter experts, SMEs, can very quickly identify processes and events, and sometimes those can one-to-one be translated one-to-one to actual events in the code. They're not just business events, but they could be events in the code, which again, my take is that is tackling complexity. Just make your code work like the business works. That's the whole point of our conversation here. Spoiler alert. Also context mapping to better visualize the relationships and also dependencies between different, I'm going to misphrase it, teams, departments, and bounded contexts. Now, bounded context is something that I think a lot of people struggle with understanding. I'm probably not doing a good job. I'm not doing it a good service by not explaining it here. But effectively, just think of it as a slice of the domain, and there are specific contexts for it. So a sale, SALE, means something different to my team than the orders team, right? Something being returned for my team is going to be something different than the warehouse team. They have a whole process and operations, making sure it still works. To my team, maybe just means we bump up the inventory by 1 or mark it as used, right? Different meanings for different teams. There are bounded contexts, there are constraints, and there are lines that help divide these contexts so we can have better understanding, more specifics. Okay, so there's way better definitions out there of that, but some of the artifacts, the takeaways from strategic design during this design phase that you can create is like a conceptual domain model. Again, that map of the bounded contexts or contexts, and most, I think, super important is a ubiquitous language glossary. You have a list of all those key phrases and what they mean for you in your team. So, okay, let's get through here. So tactical design, a bit shorter, but this is, for a lot of people, this is the fun part. This is where you get to code. Really, it's the implementation of your strategic design. I know tactical and strategic, for me, for the longest time, I'd get them mixed up. But really, this is like taking action on the strategic design. These are activities that will get you into the code. So that means designing entities and value objects, designing them, defining the constraints, identifying the aggregates, things like that. Domain services and making that domain model a reality with an actual domain model. So is this domain-driven design? No. These diagrams don't represent a 600-page book. Of course not. That would be silly. Now, I do want to highlight one of the many awesome conversations that were had at Explore DDD. Really, I've rewatched a lot of the conversations on the YouTube channel, but one that I really liked was from Javiera Lasso about the journey to implement DDD across an organization. I thought that was very fascinating. So that's a larger scope, but it gives you an idea of some of the challenges of trying to bring it on board for multiple teams and things like that. So I just want to shout that out while we're kind of in the throes of DDD. So looking back at this diagram, now that we've kind of discussed tactical and strategic designs, this might make a bit more sense. If you would like to see it more in depth or get a better understanding of it, there is the GitHub link at the bottom. This is from the DDD crew. So if you were just to Google DDD crew GitHub, you will land where you need to. Again, okay, I'm probably overusing this meme. I apologize. This is another awesome exercise. Being able to better map out and identify what a bounded context is. What is its purpose? What's the inbound or upstream communication? What's the downstream or outbound communication? Things like stakeholders, ubiquitous language, qualifications, things like that. These are really powerful exercises that, again, you don't have to be a master and have read the full DDD book, but just having these templates for you and your team can really open up a lot of value-bearing opportunities. You might be looking at things a bit differently. And how this ties into event sourcing is, well, when you design events, you design your aggregates and how they correlate, right? The categories of streams and how they might perhaps interact with each other. You really can build richer, more specific, I'll say granular, but sometimes you want lots of data, very specific processes that are modeled after the business, because DDD, as it's been said by a lot of people, but Derek Comartin comes to mind. DDD just means you give a crap about the code in the business and how things work. Yes. So how do we do this? So let's go over some of the basics of event sourcing, just kind of comb over it and just apply what we just talked about. Again, because we're not diving into super big examples or spending hours on this. So hopefully, if you're familiar with some event sourcing concepts, this might give you a new light or new view of these things. So CQRS, command query responsibility segregation. This is something that a lot of event sourcing systems just do because of the nature of things, right? You're writing events, you're reading the projections or read models, things like that. Having good design structure, excuse me, with your commands, knowing what the user needs to be doing. So if Erik needs a shopping cart so I can purchase things, then I can build, obviously this is the best example, a very good model that's very specific to what needs to happen. In this case, it's just a cart ID and a client ID that references myself or whomever is opening a shopping cart. So if I add in Legend of Zelda, then there's an event called add product. Let's reference that cart, right? That stream ID, and then let's reference that product item. And again, we could have a GUID or an int or a string representing the product. That's not very good. So let's have a value object. Let's have something that defines constraints and enables, or not enables, but ensures the rules of the business are being followed. So you can see product item on the right-hand side. It references the product ID and the quantity. That's all that needs to happen. That's all that's needed for that event. It doesn't need to know everything else. If it does need to, as part of, let's say, a read model or something, it can reference these identifiers at a later time. But for right now, all that matters is, oh, you're adding a product, give me the ID and give the amount. And honestly, something I just did in a project, I'm looking at this now and I should have updated it, is that in the e-commerce code example that you all are able to check out on GitHub, I don't use ints, don't use integers for quantity anymore. There's a value object to ensure you're actually adding an intentional value, so not -2. Because in this context, negatives aren't allowed. So how do we enforce that? Let's use a value object instead of having what is called primitive obsession by using an int, because you might have tests around it, but why do you need write tests? Why don't you just have a value object to enforce it? Bada boom, bada bing, right? Now you are forced to have a positive integer. Okay. Let's go over this slightly, but this is just a handler for how this command is handled. So again, you take in the product ID, you take in the quantity, which is an int. I just rambled about that, I know. Having a bit of a guard there, saying, hey, is that product ID? Is it, it's not empty or null, right? Okay. And then after that, things are done depending on the quantity. If an int is given that's null, like a nullable int, throw an exception, right? So there's some logic here, but again, by having a value object instead of a primitive, this could be all out of the box. I'm kind of kind of critiquing my own old code here, which is funny. So is this domain-driven design because we're using a value object? No. Again, this is just one of the tools in this very wide tool set. Again, this tool set includes tactical stuff for code implementation, again, like entities, value objects, things like that. And then there's the strategic, which is really one way I look at it is your team doing the right thing? Are you guys in the right direction? Are you enforcing certain things? Have you interviewed? Do you understand the language, the context, things like that? So this is, again, a bit more on the CQRS bit of the query side or read side. Let's go through here. But again, these are applicable to your queries as well. You can ensure certain things are being done correctly by just modeling it correctly. And again, to quote Derek Comartin, just giving a crap on how it's being done, right? Little crude, but I mean, that's what it is. So by having a query handler that now, again, checks to make sure your ID isn't null and it's not empty, if everything looks good, awesome. And maybe that sounds bland and boring, but it should be. Honestly, in my experience of writing CQRS, event-driven, event sourcing type systems using concepts from DDD, it is some of the most boring code there is because you are defining everything, and it enables just so much value to be brought because you're not focusing on tests or all these other things. You're just writing the exact rules. And sometimes that means checking for nulls and empties and other things a bunch. But if you model things well, again, by using value objects and such like that, your domain models, your entities, it just makes life so much easier. So you can focus on how you can provide value in other areas or how you can leverage the data, which, to the first point of this presentation, you should give a toot about the data that's being persisted initially, not later on and making sense of it in some ETL process or CDC. They still have their rules and their a part to play. That's the phrase, a part to play in all of this. But by modeling things well and ensuring it adheres to the business and just getting that data good the first time and persisting that, you can then make sense of it much more easily when producing projections, remodels, or having those other processes I kind of was harping on. And really, that's the event sourcing superpower in a nutshell, is by having these qualitative methodologies applied to your events and the streams and how things are being processed. It allows for so much other capabilities and value to be wrought because you stored things well right off the bat, not later, not making sense of it, just having things modeled right after the business. So here's some more code. I'm actually going to skip over this in interest of time, but these slides will be available, and it talks about how a query is returning a read model. If you're interested in this is in C#. So altogether, okay, yeah, this diagram is probably a little overwhelming if you're new to this, but by having everything being separated, and that could mean distributed, that could just be in a monolithic service that has one instance that's running in the cloud. But by having things being logically separated with different roles, having these good constraints being implemented because of the tactical patterns that you've learned, you can get a lot of value out of this. So this is, again, one of my favorite diagrams. I think I say this every time. I bring this up even in meetings and working with clients and other folks, or even just friends which are wondering how does event sourcing and event store DB work. I use this diagram a whole lot, but you have your rights, which again, those are your events, and they are put into streams, and they can have categories and groupings and things like that. But then they produce or can produce reads. And another way to put it or word it is that there's the source of truth side. By implementing these techniques, you can have a very clean, effective source of truth that really shouldn't be ambiguous at all. Everything should make sense. Probably should have worded this earlier, but I like to think that a good bar for knowing if you are doing event sourcing well is that if your subject matter experts can look at your events and they make sense of them and understand, oh yeah, these are words I use every day. I understand what's happening when it says fulfillment order placed, customer order returned, things like that. Like these, they are seeing things that are named after the business, and they see values that aren't labeled with small variables, right? Like where quantity is just QTY, right? Like you don't have to decipher things in the events. By having everything being well named and placed, it allows for your reactive side, again, sometimes called the read side, to be more productive. You can be more imaginative with your subject matter experts, saying, hey, okay, so if we get these events, or we have a projection and these things line up, or this criteria is met, what kind of reactivity could we have? Do we need to have a notification be sent out? Do we need that notification then to turn into an email or send an alert? Do we need to produce another read model? Do we need to have it append to another stream? There's like a spoiler alert for a future webinar, but aggregate of aggregates of sorts. For those that are familiar with event sourcing, that might sound terrifying, but I'm referring to process managers. But it allows for so much capability. So again, you're upstream by having well-written domain events. In this context of e-commerce, allows you to have really well-defined remodels for those marketplaces and those auctioning websites, right? And you can have notifications ringing. You can have your other teams be notified of when things are done, or if there's a holdup, anything like that, if there's an error, things like that. So really, what I'm getting at is by employing these techniques that we really just barely, I mean, I barely glanced over them. Think of it in a larger scope of applying that to systems, right? Thinking of having your defined streams in a service, like a microservice or what have you, but then how does that interact with other services? Do you want to leverage something like Event Store DB to also be that message bus? I mean, you can. There are other technologies out there that do that exceedingly well. So you can have your event store events be contained and encapsulated in that service. And if something needs to go out to a partner, upstream, downstream, what have you, right? Having those outside events, as they're called, and implementing tactical concepts that are really well defined. There's no ambiguity, right? Having your teams communicate, understanding, oh, right, when your team references this in your context, it means that. By having that ubiquitous language being built up and each team implementing these things, it really makes development a lot smoother for everyone. Gosh, so kind of mentioned it earlier, but thinking of streams, aggregates of aggregates, transitioning these events into more message-centric things and communicating over a distributed network for a distributed system. Again, you could do that all with Event Store DB, or you can implement other technologies to leverage the outside events. There's all sorts of preferences and things like that. That's another discussion. But yeah, so hopefully a bit of a cliffhanger there, but hopefully by just glancing over tactical design, strategic design, understanding how they can be impactful to your events, your entities, your value objects, everything is given quality up front rather than trying to harvest it in your CDC, ETL, and I'm just kind of throwing a bunch of terms out, it feels like, but all these other processes to make sense of things. You should be able to make sense of things initially. And of course, there might be a lot of metadata and looking at trends over long periods of time, but having an immutable log of everything that's happening in an event store, like Event Store DB, makes that a whole lot easier. So why don't you just make it easier on yourself and give a darn up front? That's my sales pitch, and that's probably why I'm not in sales. But yeah, you should definitely think about some of these patterns and concepts your next go around. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them, please.
Thank Thank you so much, Erik. That was awesome. We haven't got any questions as such. One attendee said, my company is using this concept pretty well. Yay, that's great. Great to hear that the concepts are being used well. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you do have any questions afterwards, as Erik said, please reach out and we'll be happy to answer them then. But if not, thank you so much for joining us today, and until next time.
Thanks, everyone.